This week's story is about 4 people who enter a self-contained biosphere together, intending to stay there for 5 years. But when a disaster occurs outside, some serious differences develop between them. It's beautiful, isn't it? Gerald Swift was standing on the side of Grail Hill, looking down at the Biosphere in the valley below. The Biosphere was a geodesic dome nearly 200 metres high and just as wide. "It's incredible," said Maple. "I can't wait. It's going to be amazing." "You do realise, guys," said Tarquin, "what we're doing is going to revolutionise how people think about life, the planet, everything. When we come out, we're going to be more famous than Neil Armstrong. We'll all have to be ready for that." Cambodia put her arm around Tarquin's waist. "It'll be like stepping back into the Garden of Eden," she said. The air was still chilly on the hillside, and they were all dressed in the very latest breathable fabrics. Cambodia wore a bright pink jacket, contrasting sharply with Gerald's dark green body warmer and traditional flat cap. Of course, Gerald wore the cap in postmodern ironic imitation, which might, if he had lived a lot longer, perhaps have gradually transmuted into sincere traditionalism, indistinguishable from the real thing. "Well," said Gerald, "let's go down. There's still a lot to be done before launch day." It was a rainy day in spring when the 4 of them gathered outside the entrance of the Biosphere. A small crowd of people had assembled, including a handful of reporters and some bloggers. Richard Emmerstein, the entrepreneur who had funded the project and more than anyone else was the public face of it, was in full impresario mode. "We're all here to witness a historic occasion," he said, as the crowd huddled under umbrellas and held magazines over their heads to fend off the rain. "Our 4 intrepid explorers, who today will enter the Biosphere's main airlock, will not emerge again until 5 years have passed. The Biosphere, as most of you know, is fully self-contained. Nothing will leave it or enter it for 5 years, not even air. The lessons we hope to learn from this experiment will enable humanity to colonize other planets and perhaps even to fly to distant stars." He carried on in the same vein for another 5 minutes before deciding, in view of the rain, that brevity was the best part of valour. "Are there any questions?" he asked. A bedraggled reporter sheltering under a copy of the magazine that had specially printed to celebrate the official launch of the Biosphere waved his hand. "Yes," said Richard. "This question is addressed specifically to Gerald," said the reporter. "Gerald, 2 years ago you said the following in a social media post, quote, 'Kill all the bankers. Peace, love and light. Namaste.' End quote. I just wondered, isn't that incitement to violence, and do you still stand by that statement?" "First of all," said Gerald without missing a beat, "peace, love and light is my signature and I use it on all my posts. So that's not really part of the actual post. My views are constantly evolving, and since the Korean First National Bank has chosen to provide funding for our work, I've realised that banking can be a force for good." "Next question," said Richard, waving at a young woman who worked for a magazine called Eco Warrior and had sensibly brought an umbrella. "Is it true that the team won't be taking any kind of communication device into the Biosphere?" she asked. "I'm glad you asked that," said Richard. "Thank you, Trish. Yes, we want to simulate the conditions that might apply on a long space voyage, where communication signals might take months to arrive. So we've decided against the team having any contact at all with the outside world." "Really amazing," said Trish, solemnly. "Is it true that you are pagans?" shouted a middle-aged American in a grey raincoat, who seemed surprisingly composed under his umbrella. "Yeah, we all follow the pagan religion of our ancestors," said Tarquin. We believe paganism is far more compatible with modern science than Christianity, which we consider a destructive import. For example, the Earth may be conceptualized as a living organism, which we call Gaia, and paganism embraces that. There were several more questions in spite of the weather, but finally it was time for the team to enter the dome. Maple, Gerald, Tarquin and Cambodia filed in one by one, waving at the reporters, exactly like astronauts leaving on a long mission. Inside the biosphere, they made their way to the clearing in the centre. "I'd like to say a prayer to the great Earth Spirit, Gaia," said Gerald. "Oh, that would be so cool," said Maple. "Let's close our eyes and join hands," said Gerald. They stood in a circle, hands linked. "Gaia, Spirit of the Earth," said Gerald, "bless our endeavour. Protect us from misogyny, racism, homophobia and transphobia." "And non-binary phobia," said Maple. "And non-binary phobia," said Gerald. "And queer phobia," said Tarquin. "That's already covered," said Gerald. "I don't think it is," said Tarquin. "Lots of people identify as queer, but they're not homosexual, non-binary or trans." "I know someone who identifies as the moon," said Cambodia. "It's on the queer spectrum." Gerald sighed. "Okay, and queer phobia," he said. Then he paused. "I've forgotten what I was saying now." They stood in silence till Gerald resumed. "May our journey together here help solve the climate crisis and heal the whole world. Namaste." "Namaste," said the others all together. They opened their eyes. "We've got a lot of work to do," said Gerald. "Sure, but not today," said Tarquin. "Today is a day of celebration. Cambodia and I want to do a ayahuasca voyage. You're very welcome to join us." "I appreciate the offer," said Gerald, "but I had a really bad experience last time, so I'll pass." "You probably didn't take enough," said Cambodia. "I'm not taking even more," said Gerald. "Your loss, man," said Tarquin. "Gerald and I are going to tend the crops," said Maple. "If we respect nature, nature will respect us." "We're all respecting nature in different ways," said Cambodia. Inside, the huge dome was divided into multiple different levels and contained several small geodesic domes that functioned variously as bedrooms, bathrooms or kitchens. Tarquin and Cambodia went off to be alone in a small dome they referred to as an inclusive organic feeling space. "They should really be helping us," said Maple later, as she and Gerald carefully transplanted tomato seedlings into a bed of organic compost. From somewhere across the other side of the dome, the sound of retching and flatulence could be heard. "I just wish the Biosphere didn't magnify sounds like this," said Gerald. "I don't begrudge them one day of celebration." "It sounds like they're dying," said Maple. "I don't see the appeal in it." "It was ayahuasca that made me realise we have to do something about the climate emergency," said Gerald. "It opens the third eye. I've been to Peru 3 times to take it. I'm just tired of it now. My last trip was really bad." "What did you experience?" asked Maple. Gerald looked up and gazed into the distance, or as much as he could manage, inside the dome. "Diarrhea mostly," he said. Several weeks passed by uneventfully. The 4 successfully cooperated together, planting seeds, transplanting seedlings, harvesting crops, filtering water, and doing 100 other things that took up at least 8 hours a day for each of them. One warm day, when the biosphere had become a little too warm for anyone's liking, they assembled in the eastern inner dome to harvest potatoes. "Tarquin's got an announcement to make," said Cambodia, her arm proudly around Tarquin's waist. "Oh, what's that?" said Gerald. "Guys, here's the thing. said Tarquin. All my life I've been very drawn to wolves, and now I understand why. I've realised I am a wolf. Gerald and Maple looked at each other in bafflement. What does that actually mean? Said Maple. Great question, said Tarquin. Obviously I'll still be performing my duties, because those are essential right now, even though many of them go against my nature as a wolf. So I guess the main change is just going to be that my pronouns will be wolf, wolf, and wolf self. Those are my second person, possessive and reflexive pronouns respectively. I'd appreciate it if you'd use them. You can't seriously expect us to use completely new pronouns for you, said Maple. We never agreed this. This isn't the time. You mean Wolf can't seriously expect us to use completely new pronouns for Wolf? Said Cambodia. And yes, Wolf does expect it. So do I. It's just basic politeness. Tarquin made a barking noise. That means Wolf agrees, Cambodia explained. Gerald laid his hand on Maple's shoulder. If that's what it takes to maintain harmony, he said, we'll do it. No, we won't, said Maple. We should have talked about this before we came in here. I'll talk to her, said Gerald to Cambodia and Tarquin. After they'd finished the harvest in a rather tense atmosphere, and Tarquin and Cambodia had gone to do some meditation, Maple rounded on Gerald. I'm not pretending he's a wolf for 5 years, she said. You can't seriously expect me to go along with this. If it keeps the peace, I'm for it, said Gerald. All we have to do is use wolf instead of he. It's not a big deal. They're taking way too much ayahuasca, said Maple. You know it. If that's part of their journey, then I'm not going to question it, said Gerald. Something caught his eye, and they both turned to see, through the plastic window in the door, Tarquin scampering around on all fours. He was making little barking noises. In summer they began to experience some difficulty in keeping the carbon dioxide level down. I don't want to use the emergency filters, said Gerald, when they held a meeting one morning to discuss the issue. That's a non-renewable resource. We should plant more banana trees, said Cambodia. Grass might work better, said Maple. We prefer banana trees, said Tarquin. Banana trees mean bananas. We've already planted another 5 in Dome B. You should have asked us first, said Maple. Wolf, said Tarquin. No, I mean plural you, said Maple. The trees won't get big enough to make much difference for several months, said Gerald. We can plant Dome E with wheat. It just releases CO2 again when it rots, said Tarquin. We'll have to try to make hay, said Gerald. What about if we plant another 10 banana trees, said Cambodia. At that moment a vast boom reached their ears, and the sides of the dome shook violently. What the devil is that? Said Gerald. They all stared at the misted sides of the dome. Gradually the light outside seemed to darken, and then a heavy rain began to pelt the biosphere. It's just a storm, said Cambodia, but she sounded as though she was trying to convince herself. Then a high wind, rising slowly to a terrible crescendo, began to blow from the direction of the coast. Maybe it's a tsunami, said Cambodia. There are no tsunamis in England, said Maple. It's the climate crisis, said Tarquin. The ice shelves have collapsed or a crucial tipping point has been reached. For some moments they stood in thought, growing paler. It could be nuclear war, said Maple quietly, breaking the silence. If it was nuclear war we would have seen a huge bright flash, said Gerald. Trust Wolf, this is climate related, said Tarquin. Wolf needs to look at Professor Higgins' calculations. Wolf has a book about it. Higgins told us the Arctic could start emitting exponentially increasing quantities of methane at any moment. We'd probably lost the Gulf Stream completely. We shouldn't rush to any conclusions, said Maple. It could be lots of things. We should say a prayer to Gaia, said Gerald. For some reason, Gaia has preserved us. Everyone else may be dead. We need to give thanks. Tarquin nodded sagely. Prayer circle, he said. They joined hands, closed their eyes, and Gerald said, Gaia, great world spirit, thank you for sparing our lives. We pledge to serve you and to do everything we can to purge the scourge of humanity from your bounteous face. Give us strength, O great Earth Mother Spirit. Namaste, said Tarquin, and the others repeated it. Namaste. We all knew this was going to happen sooner or later, said Cambodia. It was only a question of when. People have ignored the science for too long. I'm scared, said Maple, watching the walls of the dome vibrate. Maybe we should go into the basement, said Tarquin. That's a good idea, said Gerald. The basement contained electrical apparatus connected to the Biosphere's solar panels and stored goods of various kinds. They huddled next to a buzzing panel of switches, listening nervously to the sound of the gale outside. Wolf doesn't like being cooped up like this, said Tarquin. Wolf wants to run free and express wolf self. We just need to stay down here till the wind dies down and the climate stabilizes, said Gerald. The whole world could be destroyed, said Maple gloomily. We probably can't expect any kind of stabilization anytime soon, said Tarquin. Once a tipping point is reached, things get worse and worse very rapidly. I knew this would happen, said Cambodia. Wolf predicted this would happen. She tousled Tarquin's hair. Didn't you, Wolf? She added. Tarquin made a noise halfway between a growl and a whimper. Then he said, I've always followed the science pretty closely, especially Higgins' work. His predictions have been stunningly accurate. Didn't he predict the ice caps would melt by 2020? Said Maple. That was just journalists, said Tarquin. He's never said that. I thought he said, began Maple, but Gerald interrupted her irritably. Maple, this isn't the time, he said. What are we going to do now? Said Cambodia. This doesn't change anything, said Gerald. We just need to carry on doing what we're doing. When the 5 years are up, we'll see what we'll see. We can't wait 5 years to find out if the whole world has been destroyed, said Maple. Richard promised to stand outside the date tree at the back if we need to know anything really important, said Gerald. We need to check if he's there at noon every day. I usually remember to check. Well, Wolf thinks that's a very good idea, said Tarquin. If the world has been destroyed, as Wolf believes it has, we definitely need to know about it. Later that day the wind died down and the biosphere was still intact. The light that filtered through the biosphere's translucent panels was strangely dim and grey, as though the evening had arrived early. It might just be very cloudy outside, said Gerald, anxiously examining the exterior light levels on his computer. The sun may remain shrouded by clouds for many centuries, said Tarquin, in which case nothing is ever going to grow in here. Let's go and look at the back, said Maple. At the back of the biosphere was an unshaded area where they grew cacti and date palms. They swiftly made their way there. Oh God, said Cambodia. Richard's already here. The unshaded panels were covered with a layer of dust, beyond which the sky itself seemed ashen, but it was just possible to make out the form of Richard's body lying on the ground. He was holding a white placard which had fallen on its face along with the rest of Richard, and he appeared to be dead. That settles it, said Tarquin. Wolf is going outside to take climate readings. No, you can't, said Gerald. You mustn't. Now more than ever, we need to preserve the integrity of the dome. People may look to us to show them how to survive. We must continue with the project. Tarquin digested this idea quietly as they all stood there looking at Richard's unmoving body. Then he said, still staring at Richard, And that's a fair point. In the world outside the dome, people talked of almost nothing else but the nuclear strike on England. Several hundred square miles had been hopelessly contaminated. Thousands of people had been killed and thousands more were dying. The puzzling thing was, the strike had occurred against a relatively unpopulated area. There was little there of any special significance. At first, many blamed the event on North Korea. Others argued that Iran must be responsible, and still others favoured Russia. But it was pointed out that Russia would surely have made a better job of targeting something important. North Korea gradually emerged as the prime suspect, and Britain and her allies came within inches of turning the entire country of North Korea into a nuclear wasteland, until a whistleblower managed to blow the whistle on a secret nuclear reprocessing plant at the centre of the blast area. A vast wave of protest threatened to topple the government, until the actual reason for the explosion was uncovered. A gang of self-described eco-warriors, including several physicists, had deliberately engineered the explosion as part of some sort of protest. The gang were quickly captured, and the public were induced to see the incident as just another unfortunate case of mass murder. There were even those who supported the gang's actions. Major Stephen Armitage Halstead was placed in charge of evacuating survivors from the blast zone. A meeting was held involving Halstead and the heads of various relevant agencies and ministries to discuss tactics. It was Chris Warwick, a grey bespectacled man who was head of the Department of Energy, who brought up the Biosphere. "How many people are in there?" said Halstead, dressed in military greens and businesslike bordering on rude as far as Warwick was concerned. "5, said Warwick. "Very low priority," said Halstead. "There's probably a few hundred people out there now wandering about with their skin hanging off, and there's going to be hundreds more holed up in their houses that we won't be able to rescue for days. There might be some symbolic significance attached to rescuing the Biosphere people," said Warwick. "I don't give a monkeys about symbolic significance," said Halstead. "Go and rescue them yourself if you care that much." Inside the Biosphere, the four were discussing their plans. "We need to plant more wheat," said Gerald. "It needs relatively little light compared to some of our other crops. I'm very uneasy about wheat considering the gluten content," said Tarquin. "It could cloud our third eyes," said Cambodia. "We need to be very careful about anything that could disrupt our biological processes. If we don't get enough food, we won't have any biological processes to disrupt," said Maple. "I just think we need to follow the science," said Gerald. "What does that even mean?" said Maple. "Cambodia and Wolf are gonna embark on a 3-day ayahuasca voyage," said Tarquin. "Open ourselves fully to Gaia's teachings and to the wisdom of Woden and Freya." "Surely we need to be thinking about crops," said Gerald. "We need to figure out how to feed ourselves, given lower light projections." "We will delay the voyage by a week so we can assist with the planting," said Tarquin. For a week, Gerald fretted over crop projections, and they anxiously monitored the weather for signs of improvement. The external weather station, unbeknownst to any of them, was plastered in an oily film of radioactive dust and no longer gave accurate readings. The dust was visible on the transparent panels of the dome itself, and they had no way of cleaning it off. After a week had passed, Tarquin and Cambodia retreated to open themselves to whatever information the universe might offer them. Meanwhile, Gerald's calculations weren't working out. Light intensity is down 60%, he said to Maple as he stared at a computer screen. If this continues over the whole year, we just won't have enough to feed 4 people. Maybe we can feed 3 people on a restricted diet. We'll just have to leave the biosphere, said Maple. What if the whole world's like this, said Gerald. If the ice shelves have melted and the Arctic methane jets have gone into overdrive, we're probably looking at centuries of starvation. Maybe only a few hundred people will survive on the whole planet. Okay, said Maple, but there's a chance things are still fine nearer the equator, isn't there? Anything near the equator will probably turn to desert, Maple. This is basic physics. We've known about it for decades. There must be something we can do, said Maple. I don't know what, said Gerald, still staring at the charts on the screen. From the far side of the dome, the sound of retching reached their ears. They're going to damage their stomachs if they carry on like this, said Maple. No, it's actually good for you, said Gerald distractedly. Cleanses the system. I don't even notice it anymore. It's like the ticking of a clock. A particularly loud spell of vomiting rose to meet their ears. Cambodia's having a bad time of it, said Maple. I need to work on these figures, said Gerald. I'll leave you in peace then, said Maple, and she went off to look at the wheat. On her way to the wheat, she stopped off to check the transparent area at the back. Then she ran back to Gerald. You need to come and look at this, she said. I'm busy, he said. Seriously, she said. He turned round and saw the shocked expression on her face. All right, he said, and they made their way to the back of the dome. Outside the dome stood a young woman, slumped against the perspex, gazing into the biosphere. When she saw them, she slapped her hand against the plastic, wearily but with an obvious desperation. The long blonde hair on one side of her head had been scorched off, and one eye was entirely white. Her clothes were covered with dust, blood, and vomit. We have to let her in, said Maple. We can't violate the sanctity of the biosphere, said Gerald. We can't just leave her there, said Maple. We could try to get her to go round to the airlock. That airlock needs to stay sealed for 5 years, said Gerald, or the whole experiment is invalidated. Balls to the experiment, said Maple. She's dying. She's probably a victim of looting, said Gerald. They're killing each other out there over food. We haven't even got enough for ourselves for the next year. We're not letting her in, that's final. Who made you the boss? Said Maple angrily. You're not our leader. There's no hierarchy in here. We should at least consult Cambodia and Tarquin. From a quarter of the way around the dome, the sound of Cambodia vomiting with renewed vigour reached their ears, followed by Tarquin howling. Yeah, I don't think so, said Gerald. They're not even currently participating in consensus reality. Suddenly the woman vomited blood over the perspex panels. Then she collapsed, leaving bloody finger trails on the plastic. After a series of convulsions, she lay still. Poor girl, said Maple. There are probably billions in the exact same situation, said Gerald. Is that a corpse up there on the hill? Said Maple. Maybe, said Gerald, squinting. Several days later, Gerald was asleep in a hammock when a vigorous shaking roused him to his senses. It was Tarquin and Cambodia. They appeared dishevelled and unwashed, and a little wild-eyed. Gerald, said Tarquin. What? Said Gerald. I'm exhausted. I've been planting beans and wheat all day. We've had a profound experience, said Tarquin. The Mother Goddess has shown us the way. Gerald, be honest. Is there enough food to feed us now that the climate apocalypse is here? No, there isn't, said Gerald. You smell like vomit. Have you stopped washing? Washing is a strain on our resources, said Cambodia. We all need to rethink washing. Totally, said Tarquin. But never mind that now. Gerald, the human race has angered Gaia with its profligacy. We have molested the Earth and stolen its resources. Gaia is angry at us, Gerald. Gaia has smited us with climate change, said Cambodia. It's basic physics, said Tarquin. What do you want me to do about it? Said Gerald, wiping sleep from his eyes. Maple doesn't see it like we do, said Tarquin. She's not following the science. We've let an unbeliever into our midst. Steady on, said Gerald, sitting up and almost falling out of his hammock. We're all in this together. There's no need to cast the finger of blame. Gaia demands a sacrifice, said Tarquin. Freya, the Mother Earth goddess, has shown us what needs to be done. Are you with us or against us? What exactly are you, Wolf, proposing? Said Gerald indignantly. Great question, said Tarquin. So, we're proposing we kill Maple and offer her to Gaia, thus appeasing Gaia's wrath and also saving food. What the hell is wrong with you? Shouted Gerald. We're not sacrificing Maple. Go and get your head straight. Wolf is just thinking outside the box, said Tarquin. Give it some consideration. That's all Wolf is saying. Gerald's first thought was to go and tell Maple about Tarquin's bizarre and murderous proposal. He found her in the herbarium, picking sage. Oh, hi, Ger, she said pleasantly. Gerald could see worry was ingrained in the lines of her face. He knew Maple liked to pick herbs to calm herself down. Hey, we've already got a lot of dried sage, he said. I know, but you can never have too much sage, she said. We can have too much sage, said Gerald. We should be picking rosemary, if anything. I like sage more than rosemary, said Maple. Stop trying to patriarchize me. I'm not patriarchizing you, said Gerald. I'm a staunch feminist, you know that. Funny how your version of feminism always benefits men somehow, said Maple. Can you stop with the microaggressions, said Gerald. Yes, that's right, deflect it all onto me like a typical man, said Maple. I don't do that, said Gerald. You're gaslighting me. You're gaslighting yourself, said Maple. What's that supposed to mean? Said Gerald. He could feel his anger rising. Somehow the conversation had turned into a debate, and the debate had turned into an argument, and now it had a life of its own. Like a forest fire, he thought. I like sage, shouted Maple. Gerald stormed off, rage boiling inside him. How dare she, after all the effort he had put into his feminism? Actually, she was acting like a colonial overlord, he thought. He should have said that. He nearly went back to accuse her of colonization, but instead he went back to check his calculations. You can always rely on a computer, he said to himself. Objective facts, that's what he needed. The computer told him the same thing as before. He appreciated its consistency. If they all cut back to 2,000 calories a day, 3 of them might have enough. With 4 people, they would starve. Follow the science, he said out loud. Not for another month did he raise the subject with Tarquin and Cambodia. He waited till Maple had gone off to tend the quinoa. They were sitting in the mini meditation dome, which still smelled faintly of vomit. Wolf, said Gerald. That idea Wolf had about Maple. Pay no attention, comrade, said Tarquin. Wolf was just high. Sometimes the ayahuasca goddess reveals too much all at once. Wolf was just high, echoed Cambodia, nodding. The thing is, said Gerald, we've only really got enough food for 3 people, and she is annoying. Tarquin inhaled deeply, closing his eyes. He was sitting in the lotus position. Hypothetically, if we did make a sacrifice of her, we would be mollifying Gaia but also following the science, he said. That's what you're telling Wolf. If you want to put it that way, said Gerald. Cambodia, what do you think? I think we should always trust the science, said Cambodia. It's basic physics, innit? If there's only enough food for 3 people, one of us needs to shed the human bodily form. Also, I'm 90% sure she stole my vegan hot chocolate powder. You just don't steal a person's hot chocolate powder, said Tarquin, shaking his head. How would we do it? Said Gerald. Great question, said Tarquin. We found some death caps growing near the spruces. They say half of one can be enough. We can make some pasties, said Cambodia. Like Cornish pasties but with mushrooms. Sort of like a pie, said Tarquin. I know what a pasty is, said Gerald. We put death caps in one, normal mushrooms in the others, said Cambodia. We put everyone's initial on them so we know which is which. Then we feed it a fatal pasty. You've really thought about this, said Gerald in awe. We've whiteboarded it extensively, said Tarquin, just in case plans were needed. How would she, said Gerald. It'd start 6 to 12 hours after she eats it, said Tarquin. Nausea, vomiting, seizures, jaundice, probably diarrhea. By the time symptoms appear, it's already too late. Her organs will be messed up. I don't really want her to suffer, said Gerald. Kill her yourself then, said Cambodia. No, I couldn't, said Gerald. There's a school of thought that says human sacrifices are worth more if they suffer more, said Tarquin. The suffering shows we are serious about our dedication to the Mother Earth spirit. It makes sense scientifically, said Cambodia. I don't see how, said Gerald. Well, it's not incompatible with science anyway, said Cambodia. For a couple of weeks, Gerald agonised over the matter. In the end, he decided it really did come down to science. There just wasn't enough food for 4 people. That was what the science was telling him, so it had to be done. At least mushrooms are natural, he said eventually to Tarquin. It's what she would want. Cambodia and Gerald prepared the pasties, carefully rolling out pastry made from their own wheat flour, mixed with butter from the milk of their 2 goats, Greta and Judith. They rolled the pastry out and carefully filled 3 circles with a mixture made from mushrooms, potato and nuts, folding the circles over and crimping them expertly with their thumbs, before baking at 200 degrees for 25 minutes. Each pasty was carefully inscribed with an initial by Cambodia. The 4th pastry circle was treated identically to the other 3, except the mushrooms were replaced with death caps and the pastry inscribed with an M for maple. They served the steaming hot pasties for dinner. They look delicious, said Maple enthusiastically. Oh, they've even got our initials on. Thank you so much. What an unexpected treat. That evening, when they went to bed, Maple entertained no suspicion of what the other 3 had planned for her. On the contrary, in spite of there having been a slightly weird atmosphere at dinner, she felt that a certain amount of bad blood between them had been laid to rest with a generous and unanticipated peace offer. She resolved to do something nice for Cambodia and Tarquin as soon as possible, and she went to sleep feeling happy and contented, thinking about presents or recipes that she could make for the other 3. Gerald awakened around 7 the following morning to the now familiar sound of vomiting, but this time ayahuasca wasn't the cause. Wolf is ill, said Gerald, shaking Maple awake. Are you okay? How are you feeling? I'm fine, Gerald, said Maple, slightly annoyed at having been woken up early. She rubbed her eyes and noticed Gerald's pale face and anxious air. Is it serious? She asked. He has vomiting and diarrhea, said Gerald. Are you sure you're okay? I'm fine, said Maple. How are you? It's probably just a stomach bug or something. I wouldn't worry. As the day progressed, Tarquin's condition worsened. The whites of his eyes began to turn yellow. "This could be serious," said Maple, as they stood looking down at Tarquin, who was lying on a bed next to a bucket of vomit. "Maybe we should go out and try to find a doctor. I don't know what it could be." "No need," said Gerald. "I think I know what it is." Cambodia looked daggers at him, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. "What?" said Maple. "It's Hallam's syndrome," said Gerald. "Hallam's syndrome?" repeated Maple incredulously. "I've never heard of it. What is it?" "It causes these exact symptoms," said Gerald. He wrung his hands. "It's always fatal. His kidneys and liver are failing." "You don't know it's that," said Maple. "It could be anything." "Even if it's not that, there's nothing we can do," said Gerald. "It's too dangerous to go outside. Society's probably broken down completely. There are no doctors out there now. There are only starving, dangerous people." "I'm going to go and chance it if you won't," said Maple. "Look at him. He needs proper medical treatment." "You can't leave," said Gerald. "Who's going to stop me?" said Maple defiantly. "Me," said Gerald. "And me," said Cambodia. Maple stared at them in surprise. Then Tarquin began to have a fit. "Get some Valium from the medical supplies," Gerald shouted at Cambodia. "We've got Valium, it might help." "Does that normally help with Hallam's syndrome?" said Maple, trying to stop Tarquin writhing off the edge of the bed. "Yes," said Gerald curtly, "always." They patiently ministered to Tarquin for the whole day, Cambodia and Gerald quietly expecting him to die, Maple continually returning to the idea of finding a doctor, only to receive short shrift from the other two. And then, quite unexpectedly, in the evening, Tarquin began to show signs of recovery. The yellow retreated a little from his eyes, the vomiting subsided, and he sat up and drank lemon tea. When Maple left for a while to perform some necessary chores, he rounded on Gerald and Cambodia. "You poisoned me, you idiots," he hissed. "I had nothing to do with it," said Gerald. "I didn't do anything wrong, Wolf," said Cambodia tearfully. "You saw what I did. I put everyone's initials on the pasties. I don't see how we could have mixed them up. Maybe you got salmonella. She'll probably start dying soon. Look, you're getting better." "I didn't check mine," said Tarquin thoughtfully. "You gave it to me. If anyone mixed them up, it must have been you." "I checked it carefully, I swear to Gaia," said Cambodia. "Yours had a W on it, I'm sure of it." "W?" said Tarquin, simultaneously perplexed and angry. "For Wolf," said Cambodia. Tarquin rose bolt upright on his sick bed, veins popping in his neck, a new film of perspiration emerging on his forehead. "You stupid cow," he roared. "It's an upside down M. Her initial is M." Then he clutched his chest and grimaced in pain. "I think more Valium," said Gerald. "Oh my Gaia," said Cambodia, placing her hand over her mouth. "What have I done? But it's okay, you're getting better." "Death cap victims appear to recover after 12 hours, he said weakly. 2 or 3 days after that, it shuts down the liver and the kidneys and they die." Cambodia emitted a high-pitched cry, her eyes wide in horror. Gerald took her arm and dragged her gently out of the room. "In a way," he said quietly, "this actually solves the problem. Someone had to die. Now someone is dying. We'll probably have enough food now." "But I love him," she sobbed. "Then Gaia will appreciate your sacrifice even more," he said. "I have to go back and take care of him," she said. "Honestly, I really wouldn't," said Gerald. "He seems angry." But she shook his hand off her arm and went back into the room where Tarquin lay dying. All that night and into the next day, the sound of shouting and crying emerged from the room. "What are they arguing about?" Maple asked Gerald, mystified. "This happens with Hallam syndrome," said Gerald. "It causes irritability and irrationality." Around noon, there was an ear-piercing shriek and the shouting stopped. Maple and Gerald were working in the herbarium at the time. "Did you hear that?" said Maple. "Of course I heard it," said Gerald. "Why would she scream like that?" said Maple. "I don't know," said Gerald in a hoarse whisper. "We'd better go and see," said Maple. In the room where Cambodia had ministered to Tarquin, a shocking sight met their eyes. Tarquin was squatting over Cambodia, his face covered in blood, and a vast, bloody wound on Cambodia's neck. Cambodia lay on the floor, apparently lifeless. For some moments they watched as Tarquin appeared to gnaw at Cambodia's neck. Then he noticed their presence, looked up and said, "I've decided to give up veganism. Wolf needs meat." Gerald and Maple bolted out of the room. "He's gone crazy," said Maple. "Is this the Hallam syndrome?" The colour had completely drained from her face and she was shaking. Gerald stopped and, grabbing her arm, turned her to face him. "Listen to me," he said. "He'll be dead in 3 days at the most. This is how it always is with Hallam syndrome. Until then he might be very, very dangerous. I think we should take some food and water and hole up in the cellar. We have to wait for him to die." "He's eating Cambodia," wailed Maple. "I know," said Gerald. "I know. We have to focus now. We have to gather supplies. Do you understand me?" Maple nodded dumbly, her lips pressed tightly together and her teary eyes wide with shock. "You get the water," said Gerald. "We'll need 12 litres at least. Use the bottles from the small kitchen. You'll be safe over there. Put it in the cellar. I'll get food from the stores." He looked around for something to use as a weapon and located a spade. "Can you do this?" he said to Maple. She nodded shakily again, tight-lipped. "Okay," he said, and he ran off towards the store cupboard and towards the sick bay. "Be careful," Maple shouted. Maple ran to the little kitchen where they bottled filtered water. She began filling bottles, her hands shaking so much that it was hard to get the water to go into the bottles. When she had filled 6 bottles, she put them into a canvas bag and ran with it towards the cellar. One more trip after this and I'd have enough, she thought. She was pulling the steel cover to the cellar open when she heard a blood-curdling yell. It sounded like Gerald. It didn't stop, but instead went on and on. She dropped the water into the cellar and began to cautiously make her way towards the screaming, shaking like a leaf and involuntarily emitting whimpering sounds. She was almost at the sick bay when the shouting stopped. It was briefly replaced with a horrid gurgling, then that also ceased, and there remained only a sound, like a wolf eating. Chewing and lip-smacking sounds were mixed with snarling and whimpering. Forcing herself to move towards the awful sounds, she reached the mini-dome that contained the sick bay and slowly poked her head around the edge of the doorway. It was dark inside, but she saw enough to make her gasp out loud. Inside, Tarquin was eating Gerald's face. When she gasped, he looked up. "I feel much better now," he said. "I think I was lacking vital fatty acids." She ran and Tarquin bounded after her on all fours, yapping like a foxhound. "Get away from me," she shouted. "Wolf must feed," shouted Tarquin. "You are not a wolf," shouted Maple. In response, Tarquin only growled. The tool for opening the cover to the cellar was next to the cover itself, where she had left it. She grabbed it and threw it into the cellar. She managed to half climb, half fall down the ladder into the cellar, and she pulled the hatch shut behind her just as Tarquin was almost on her. Without the tool for opening the cover, there There was no way he could get into the cellar, unless he could figure out a way to improvise some other way of opening the hatch. She felt around for the cellar light and switched it on. Above she could hear Tarquin pacing around, snarling. "It's Hallam syndrome," she shouted. "You've lost your mind. It's not your fault, Tarquin." "Tarquin is dead," came the growling reply. "Wolf lives." "Tarquin," shouted Maple, her voice full of despair. "I can try to get you help. Why don't you go and lie down?" "Wolf is gonna eat your liver," snarled Tarquin. Maple began to sob helplessly. For nearly 3 days she listened to the sound of Tarquin snarling and scraping at the cellar hatch, but gradually he grew weaker and the vomiting resumed. Over and over again she entreated him to let her go and find help, but in return he replied only with growling and madness. On the 3rd day he lay still, only whimpering. She cautiously pushed open the hatch. Tarquin was lying on his back some distance away, his skin yellow as a ripe banana. "Oh, Tarquin," she said, "I'm so sorry." His head turned slowly in her direction, and he regarded her with glassy yellow eyes. "Gaia needed a sacrifice," he rasped slowly. Then his gaze became fixed, and she saw that he had died. Outside the dome, Maple found a grey wasteland littered with occasional human remains, but the weather seemed normal, and the sun periodically shone through passing clouds, warming her skin. She began to walk towards the nearest town. She was almost at the town when a helicopter appeared. It descended slowly and landed in front of her. 2 figures in hazmat suits ran out and escorted her into the helicopter. "You shouldn't be in the exclusion zone," said one of the figures. "It's dangerous. What are you doing here?" "I was in the Biosphere," said Maple. "What exclusion zone?" The figures looked at each other. "Are there any more people with you?" said the other figure. "There were," said Maple. "One of them decided he was a wolf and ate the other 2. And she broke down in floods of tears. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John Purcell and all the stories on this channel are written by me. If you enjoyed this story, please burn down your house as an offering to the Great Mother Earth Spirit for me. Thank you so much. On second thoughts, don't do that. That's definitely illegal and not a good idea. If you could click the like and subscribe buttons, that would help though. Thank you so much. I have no idea what story I'm going to read next week. I was going to write one based on a nightmare I had, but then I think maybe it's too similar to a story I did previously. However, I'm sure I will come up with a new story by next week, so do join me again next Monday for that. And until then, have a good week and sleep well.